We are so pleased to have Jeff Trask here for this presentation. Jeff is our IAFCC board president and the founder of Champaign County Christian Health Center. His session is called I Get It, I Don't Get It, and I will let him explain to you what he means by that. So if you have any questions while Jeff is talking, feel free to put them in the Q&A down at the bottom of your screen. I know there are a bunch of little buttons across the screen there. Pick the one that says Q&A, and that way we can see your questions pop up, and Jeff will answer as many as he can throughout the session. And without further ado, I will hand things over to Jeff.
Thank you, Laura. Welcome, everyone. It's exciting to be a part of this. It's a 10th year anniversary conference. My name is Jeff Trask, and I look forward to our session, and I'll say up front that I definitely would like us to have some discussion. So please be thinking of questions and comments along the way. I'm actually probably going to pause probably about halfway through even, just so we can have a time to answer the question before we get all the way through the presentation. So my title is I Get It, I Don't Get It. And do not let my background misinform you. I'm not as sophisticated as my background indicates. Matter of fact, my title comes from South Park. And it refers to an episode where there was an incident where one of the white parents in South Park made a major faux pas against Black people on a game show. And throughout the episode, the son of that white person who made the faux pas has a Black friend. And during the episode, he keeps trying to explain how his dad, didn't need to do it and why it should be okay. And every time his dad would try to do something to make up for it, the son would go to the Black friend and say, hey, my dad did this, isn't it okay now? And the Black friend just kept getting frustrated over and over again. And then it wasn't until the very end of the episode where the son of the white guy who made the mistake finally goes to the Black friend and says, I get it, I don't get it. And the Black friend is like, thank you. And that's what trying to understand issues about diversity and equity and race, it really comes down to. If we are not the person or persons being in that situation or victimized, it's really hard to truly understand where people are coming from. And this applies to all types of things, whether it be by gender and sex, or by people, whether you have a disability or not, or any number of things that we find ways to divide ourselves. We really can't totally get it. Now, we can try to understand it. We can learn from it. We can learn from other people who are experiencing these things. But at the end of the day, we really need to be listeners to those who are actually experiencing various types of things in order to understand that we don't totally get it. So just a little bit about my background. As Laura mentioned, I'm the founder of the Champaign County Christian Health Center, free clinic that's been around since 2004, still operating now. I'm also the board chair for Illinois Association of Free and Charitable Clinics. It's an honor to serve in that role. My full-time hat is being an assistant professor in public health in the master's program at Benedictine University. I also have served for 11 years as the Mercy and Justice pastor of New Covenant Fellowship, which is actually the place I'm actually situated now. And I've also served in many different roles in community work, but one of the areas I'll highlight is the role I've had in the Advocacy for Justice Committee here in Champaign area. All right, so I want us to start off with the right mindset in this presentation. And I'm kind of titled this slide, The Sum of Us. And us will refer to literally us, but also the US, United States, because they're both kind of synonymous in this talk. So I know that some of us are listening to this session are eager to learn more and want to do more about racial injustice and equity and issues of the healthcare disparities and what have you. Some of us are weary from it all, hearing the latest incidents that have occurred. We're waiting for the Derek Chauvin trial to end, and all types of just things that just seem like day in and day out, there's something new that's happening. In the Chicago area, you got the Adam Toledo, 13-year-old kid who was shot and killed. It just seems like there's always something, and I know people are weary from it all. Even if you're not personally affected, you still could be weary from it. Some people feel like they have a pretty good handle on this whole racism thing, discrimination thing, and feel like I'll listen, but I'm pretty sure I'm in a good place already. And so there's some people who don't have any clue whatsoever, and they're just trying to hear to learn. And I would argue that most of us are a little bit of all these things, is the reality. So for me, anytime I do a talk, I always want to emphasize the why. Why are we talking about this issue? Why are we here discussing this? And I want to do that in for two reasons, two ways. One is just my personal experiences. For those who might have had the opportunity to hear my talk at the national conference, I explained some of the experiences I had in my interactions with police officers before the age of 19, even, where I had been stopped on my bicycle, which, again, not a motorcycle, but a bicycle, when I was 18 years old. I was held at gunpoint in my own home, and I was also stopped for having what the officer said was not out, but dim taillights. And so I've had experiences in my life where I could have easily been one of those tragedies that we have been hearing about time and time again in the news. And the reality is that no one, especially a person, 16, 17, 18 years old, when those things were happening to me, and trust me, I've had experiences since then too, but the most dramatic ones happened then, but no one should have to experience that. But all things being equal, all young people, especially young Black men, should not have to go through those type of trials and tribulations and issues. So that's one of the reasons why I think it's important, because I want to make sure we limit as much as we can as society those kind of experiences happen to others. And the other reason is that we're under this current crisis, and we're going to have reactions to the current crisis that we're experiencing. And I'll get into later about the social determinants of health and how critical it is to understand that, at least for me as an African American, when I see news stories of people getting unarmed people being shot that look like me, when we have trials where people are trying to defend someone being on someone's neck 3 minutes after unresponsive, those have psychological and even physical manifestations of health outcomes and health issues. And so I think as a health providers, it's really critical for us to understand that this whole racial injustice piece that has been plaguing our society is really a part of our health. And so it's not just this one of those sidebar things, but it's really a critical element. And I also want to make sure we emphasize that this is not just a them problem. It is an us problem. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. he regularly talked about how oppression of Black and brown people, it doesn't just affect and hurt Black and brown people, it hurts everyone. Now, maybe not to the magnitude of hurting white people much as Black and brown people, but rest assured, we as an entire society, we as an entire country suffer from the systematic and structural racism that we have. Matter of fact, Heather McGhee, in a book called The Sum of Us, talks about how discriminatory practices and hiring and voter suppression and even public swimming pools negatively affected everybody, not just Black and brown people. Again, and keep in mind that, yeah, Black and brown people suffer the most, but everyone does suffer from this. And so, in essence, most people, when we talk about these issues, caring about the issues usually not a problem. Most people care about these issues. You see these tragedies, if you have a heart at all, you're going to care about it. But the question is are we caring enough? I kind of think about it like when we have our meetings, our board meetings for our Illinois Association meetings. And one of the things we start off our meetings with is asking each board member, how have you contributed to the mission of the Illinois Association of Free and Charitable Clinics? And it's a nice way to engage and start our meetings, because it's easy to let things slip by and not really hone in on the mission of the organizations that you're a part of. And so it's just a regular reminder that we need to stay active, that our caring has to translate into actual action. And I think that's why I actually give talks like this. So this is about disparities and many other things, but I'm just going to start off with COVID-19 disparities. Our great speaker this morning mentioned some of these things, and we've heard of these things for a long time, especially those, we're on the front line. So you guys have seen this stuff up close and personal. We know that there's trauma and healthcare deserts. There's incarceration issues. There's disparities in death rates, and I have a lot of statistics and stuff like that. There's poverty-stricken communities and structural racism. And I think about, just for an example, when we see these statistics and we hear about these numbers, again, that care is there. Like if you have a heart and you hear these shocking numbers of these differences, you usually can't help but to care. But then the question is, how do we translate that caring into actual action, into policies, into procedures, into different ways of doing things? And so one of the things I thought about is, when we knew that African Americans were being stricken so much more than other groups of people when it comes to COVID, whether it be testing and now with vaccination, why wouldn't African Americans be higher on the priority list in terms of getting vaccinations if we knew these disparities exist? Why not make them a class 1A or something automatic, where we know that since there's situations like in Chicago where, you know, we have a 30-some% of the population is African American, 32%, but yet 67% of the deaths were African American. In places like that where the disparities are so striking, why not make sure that African Americans are one of the top people on the priority list? In essence, what I'm trying to get to today is really understanding that these issues of racism and discrimination, of prejudice, of injustice, these disparities and inequities and inequalities, and just plain unfairness, it really is saturated within us and saturated within the US. I had led recently these talks at my school where every single one of our employees had to go through an implicit bias training. And they also had to have a 90-minute Zoom follow-up discussion about the implicit bias training and some other issues. And what was interesting is that I always led off my discussions with the question of, what cartoon, TV commercial, movie, TV show had you watched growing up that in hindsight you realize has some racial stereotypes, undertones, you know, any kind of racism, prejudice, and, you know, within that media? And as it turned out, no one had a problem coming up with a bunch of things. There was a couple of people who didn't want to actually participate in the session at all. But those who participated in the session were easily able to come up with some type of TV show, commercial, something that. And I always had my cartoon example with Tom and Jerry, where there's a number of episodes where you have an ancient mama type character in Tom and Jerry, where you actually never see her face. You just see the bottom of her, and she's wearing all these slips and these other kind of stereotypical ancient mama type of things. And I watched that as a kid. You know, it was just one of those things. Some people mention Looney Tunes with Speedy Gonzalez, and I mean, and it's just that they're everywhere. And we've been saturated with these things, and a lot of it is not even knowing what's going on. I give you another example. When I was growing up, there was a movie called Shaka Zulu, and Shaka Zulu was a movie about British soldiers who had set up a garrison in Africa. And the movie was about Shaka Zulu trying to defend his homeland against these invading British soldiers. Now, as a 8-year-old, 9-year-old, kid watching TV on some kind of afternoon with watching this movie, it was striking in hindsight to realize that as a kid, I was rooting for the British soldiers to win and to take out as many Shaka Zulu warriors as possible, because that's how the movie was kind of set up, but also how I've been socialized up to that point to always root for white people in a situation like that, even though the British garrison was in Africa. I mean, could you imagine the African garrison in England and London, and who would actually probably be considered the good guy or bad guy in that movie? And so for me, is a reminder just how saturated we actually are, and not even knowing just how biased things are in our society. And sorry for the sirens there, but one of the things I want to emphasize that is, and this is not a saturation that's nice and refreshing, like when it rains outside you get soaked. This is more like a saturation where BP oil spill saturates and with the filth and oil and really saturates us in something nasty and sticky. Give you an example of this saturation as well, where we have in our country a glorification of those that represented treason or oppression. When we talk about monuments representing Civil War generals and other types of people they consider to be these esteemed, respectable, honorable people. And for African Americans, is similar to, if you were in Germany and you saw statues of Hitler and SS members being, littered across, parts of the country there. And people, again, don't understand that. When we see a Confederate flag that represents the oppression of slavery, where people, again, try to utilize that flag as if it's some type of, heroic and positive symbol. Again, that would be like seeing the Nazi flag in Germany being looked at as some type of positive and honorary type of symbol. And people don't want to accept that. And why? It's because the format was set years ago to change the narrative, even though that represented slavery and oppression to a massive extent for hundreds of years. It was glorified instead of acknowledged in a negative way. Matter of fact, in the book called Caste, the author talks about how Germany actually utilized the practices of Jim Crow in the United States to kind of formulate a legal way of trying to isolating and discriminating against Jewish people in Germany. So they actually got their ideas from the United States. And so we as a country really haven't come to grips with just how saturated and just how deeply embedded this problem is. And I think that's a critical part of us moving things along. Matter of fact, there's another great book called White Too Long, and actually talks about how in the church, and particularly in not just the Protestant church, but the Catholic Church and so on and so forth, where they actually did a research and found out that those who are actually not religious and who were not participants in church were found to be less racist on this racism scale than those who did go to church. So imagine this idea of, church being a place where you're supposed to be loving and accepting of people and so on and so forth, but yet they lead the way in terms of racism among those who are believers versus non-believers. And I'll give you one quick example that was shared in that book when there was a situation where a African-American in self-defense ended up killing the person he worked for. Now, in any kind of situation, a white person killing a black person in self-defense would be let off the hook. As a matter of fact, in those days, it wouldn't have to even be self-defense and the person would be let off the hook. And we know this. But in this situation, this black guy was caught and was taken to Atlanta. And literally thousands of people from surrounding towns took trains to Atlanta to publicly witness and participate in the lynching of this black man who was caught and arrested. And we're not just talking about a handful of KKK members. We're talking about the community. Children participated. Children actually gathered the brush and the sticks that they're going to use to light the fire to burn this man alive after they horribly mutilated him in front of everybody. All right. So again, I cannot emphasize enough that there's a certain amount of saturation that takes place here in our country that we just are not often aware of, but what we need to be made aware of. And again, we could go down a list. We got overt voter suppression going on, even right to this day. Police violence, as I talked about before. And by the way, police violence, even though we've heard seemingly more about it in recent years with George Floyd and other people, Breonna Taylor, so on and so forth, this is not a recent phenomenon. This has been going on now. The advent of cell phones and other media that allows to capture these things is now more prevalent, but this is not a new phenomenon by any means. These things have been going on for a very, very long time. Our education system, our justice system, our housing system, our employment systems, and of course our healthcare system. These are all areas where there are statistical proven disparities among Blacks and other Black and brown people versus dominant culture. And again, these things aren't disputed. The question is why are they the way they are? And I believe in part is because of this saturation that we often are not even aware of. And so what are our steps to changing this narrative? Well, I think the first thing is recognition. And I talked about this implicit bias training that we kind of led with my university. And what was fascinating was that part of the training, online part of the training, included a test, a racial bias test. And this racial bias test was an opportunity for people to basically discover if they had a certain bias towards white versus Black people. And this test was developed by Harvard University. So we're not talking about people who didn't know what they're doing with this test. But what's fascinating is that as I was leading these in-person or the Zoom discussions about it, many people basically thought that there was something faulty with the test, that they surely didn't have any particular bias, for white people versus Black people at all, but it was simply just an issue of them, either the way the buttons, they had to click the buttons a certain way, or the order of things. I mean, it was really fascinating that, very few people just kind of accepted the fact that they might have had some type of bias. And what's interesting is that the reality is that we all have bias. Matter of fact, we cannot function in this world without some type of bias. We categorize things in our brains in order to make sense of the world. If we didn't do that, we would not be functional. It's just a specific brain function to classify and categorize things because it's too much input, it's too much stimuli if we can't put things in a certain order. And so just by default, because not all bias is bad, there's good bias too, right? But we have biases in all types of things, but simply because that's just how our brain operates. And so when we talk about the saturation of racism and discrimination in our country, for people to not realize that they may have some implicit bias, meaning that it's not conscious necessarily, but it is there, is really fascinating that people didn't want to even recognize that. But that's a key ingredient, is to recognize that we all have these biases. And again, like I said, if a young kid watching a movie rooting for British soldier versus Shaka Zulu, I grew up with these biases. So let alone anybody else who haven't had the Black experiences I've had, not having these biases. And so it's not a matter of just denying it, but just accepting the fact that we have these. And even if you don't know what to do with it, the idea is still to accept it, because what often happens is that we stay in the denial phase. And if you look at, for example, some of the issues with police officers and violence, where it seems that a big part of it is defending the police officers in some form or fashion. And I often wonder that if, for example, Derek Chauvin, instead of having this defense that what he did was justified, that if he actually apologized, said he knew what he did was wrong, was willing to accept the punishment that went along with what he did, was genuinely remorseful and sorrowful for what happened, I think the response would be so much different by our society if that was the case. But because we don't want to accept these things, we fight against it, we grow defensive. I mean, some people might be feeling defensive now, and that's a natural reaction. I've had many sessions where that happens, but that's okay, because that's part of the growing process. It's part of actually facing these types of things and getting engaged with these kind of things. And then another part of it is, admitting that this wrong. As I mentioned with Derek Chauvin, if he admitted what he did was wrong, and in church circles, we call that repentance. But again, we all have these biases, and if we can just admit that we have them, like they say to anything, the first step to, whether the Alcoholics Anonymous or anything else, the first step is acknowledging you have a problem, right, before you can do it. Because if you don't acknowledge you have a problem, you can't fix it. And, if you don't think a problem exists and not there, how can you work on that problem? So it's admitting that these problems really truly exist. And then another part is learning. Ignorance is not bliss. And I guarantee you that as you engage in these conversations, as you read more texts and books and articles about these issues, your world will really open up in terms of getting an understanding about what's happening. Because I can guarantee you that, most of us, not all of us, did not learn about a lot of these things in school. Our curriculums are not designed to truly address, a lot of the things that have existed in our country in a negative fashion, and so we have to take the initiative to go learn for ourselves a lot of these things in order to, again, kind of accept that they're real and actually be able to do something about it. And speaking of which, that's the next part of it, is applying and acting, putting that caring into some type of action, doing something with not only what you learn, but what you come to care about, and again, going back to that question we have with our association board meetings, what are you doing to be a part of the solution? Are you just kind of sadly shaking your head every time you hear something, or are you able to translate that sadness and that anger, that frustration, and that whatever it is, the empathy, to something productive that can actually help solve these problems? And then the last thing I'll mention here before I pause for some questions is continually striving. I know a lot of people like to, whether it be attending sessions or reading books, doing trainings, they like to look at diversity issues as something you check off a box and forget about, and say, I got that done, I'm good to go. But the reality is that racism, discrimination, prejudice, these things have to be addressed on an ongoing basis. It's not something that we can simply check off a box, think we have it taken care of, and be able to move on, even though that's a extremely big temptation there. All right, so I'm going to pause here and see if I have any questions. I don't know if I have to stop screen sharing.
No questions yet, Jeff. If
No questions
anybody
yet.
has questions to submit, please, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can type them in.
Great. All right, so I'll keep going, and hopefully you guys will think of some questions along the way. All right, so I'm going to kind of gear my talk towards healthcare in particular for a little bit here. And this is some of the things I've shared before, but when it comes to healthcare, and I'll just jump straight to health disparity here. I think we're all somewhat familiar with health is in general. But health disparity is a difference in health between groups of individuals typically associated with social and economic disadvantage. We know about these disparities in various ways, as some of our clinics help people who are homeless, and obviously some have a high levels, high percentages of Black and Brown people who are disadvantaged. We're all familiar with this concept of health disparities. I do want to actually emphasize this last one though, health equity. Definition of our Centers of Disease Control Prevention says when all people have the opportunity to attain their full health potential and no one is disadvantaged from achieving this potential because of their social position or other socially determined circumstance. And of course, we have a very long way to even make things equal, let alone equitable, and hopefully we can get there. And I do want to emphasize when I talk about equality, that is doing our best to make things the same for everyone, make sure everyone has the same treatment. And we have a hard time doing that a lot of times. But equity actually implies this idea of if people have not been getting treated the same, if some have been treated better than others, that we actually make intentional, purposeful efforts to do more for those who were disadvantaged during that time to get them to the even playing field to where they should have been in the first place. That's a very important concept to understand. And when we talk about anything related to racial related issues, is that it's not just a get it fixed now type of thing, but once we work on getting it fixed now, we also have to work on making up for what was broken all this other time as well. All right. Oh, I got a couple of questions here. I'll just pause. One is White Too Long is the name of the book that deals with the church and racism. And have another question. It's the same question. So how do we, with our limited resources in our clinics, how do we have the bandwidth to actually be able to address these issues of racial inequalities and racial injustices and so on and so forth? For me, the way I would respond to that is that we have to make it as much of a priority as we do anything else we feel that's essential in our clinics. And again, I know that means pushing the limits and stretching ourselves even more, which is, it's nothing anyone wants to hear, but we definitely want to make it part of our DNA because this, like I mentioned, the saturation of these things have been part of our DNA for a long time. We have to make the solution part of our DNA as well, and so we really have to push ourselves and incorporate it in every aspect of how we run our organizations and run our clinics, and be conscious of it in every aspect of how we run our clinics. How do we set up appointments? I'll give you a quick example. One clinic in Memphis, a very, very large faith-based clinic, a lot of clinics have the issue of people not showing up for their appointments. And so instead of having a kind of an oppressive type of system to punish people for not showing up for their appointments in this community that they serve a lot of Black and Brown people, they adjusted on their end, and they basically scheduled, in their case, it was 3 times the number of appointments that was actually there, because they had calculated and did their analytics and figured out that based on the number of missed appointments, they can schedule this many people and still get their basic number of appointments filled for that day. And so there are things that we might be able to do on our end to be able to account for some of the issues, because we have transportation issues for people. We have all kind of reasons why people may not be able to show up for an appointment. So instead of kind of engaging in like these kind of punishable type practices for stuff like that, like you miss 3 appointments, you're out for good or something like that, find ways suggested on our end, which can work for everybody. And that's just an example there. Another comment question here is, let's see, like you said, often people get defensive when some of these topics are brought up. How do you suggest going about having productive conversation about some of these problems when there's pushback and defensiveness for those that you're trying to engage in conversation? Again, another great question. What I would love to say with that is that I look at these type of conversations as having positive conflict. And what I mean by that is I've heard before that conflict is like a pulse. You don't want it going too fast to give yourself a heart attack or stroke out, but you do want one. You know, when I was having these discussions at my school with these various groups, a couple of them got pretty tense. And at the end of the day, I actually said, this is great, because if we're not having some type of conflict, talking about something so difficult, then we're probably not really talking real about it. And so we really, have to kind of embrace this idea of being uncomfortable and embrace this idea of having some conflict. And I see this positive conflict because I do believe that having the conversation itself produces growth. And that conflict produces us to get to a place together further than where we were before. And I do think that a way to kind of buffer that issue as well is to have relationships with people. The more we know each other personally, the more we know each other about our lives, the more we engage with one another, the better we can have these tough conversations and be able to work through them and get through them in the end. And if I'm not fully answering any questions, feel free to do some responses here. Another question, are community partners that our clinics can reach out to assist them in the journey of changing the narratives? Are there community partners that our clinics can reach out to? That's a great question. There are various resources obviously out there. I think we are probably in need of more organizations that focus on these types of things. I know that that Harvard Institute that I mentioned earlier that put together the implicit bias training has a great number of resources and connection that things you can use to help move that dialogue along, like the implicit bias training and the implicit bias test. But there are, we do need to work on trying to develop more organizational, institutions and that can actually help guide clinics along this path. It's something that I think is a great idea, and we're clearly at a infancy stage on that regards. But that's a great thought to kind of get that going. Another question, do I have literacy levels by race and ethnicity? I do not have those off the top of my head. I definitely can look those up. But again, that's a great example of looking at what are the issues that are particularly detrimental to Black and Brown people that we might be able to account for or at least be conscious of. And again, they may not even vary in various ways, but it's important to understand and know those things so that we can adjust on our end instead of just kind of doing things the same way and then hoping we get different results, right? We all know what the definition of that is, right? I would suggest that we, as we learn more about these type of disparities, finding ways that we can actually be creative. I think that's another key ingredient, is being creative about how we approach these issues and doing something out the box. All right, and another question, do you feel that there's as much racial inequity and inequality amongst those that are at or below the poverty level as groups well above the poverty level? That's a intricate type of question. It's a great question. I think there are things that naturally happen that are problematic for those who are low income, that they have a certain set of issues. And so they kind of get a double dose of some of the problems that I'm talking about by being low income and also being people of color. While those who may not be of low income, but a person of color, they still obviously experience things. There was a couple of years ago where I was around my mom's neighborhood, walking around down the street, 3 cop cars stopped me and my brother and started asking us questions. Clearly, we weren't in a disadvantaged area. It was a nice suburb of Chicago. So there's going to be ongoing discrimination no matter who you are if you're a person of Black or brown color. But there's another layer just because of being low income that you have to deal with and address too. You also realize that while people often think of people low income being majority Black and brown people, but by sheer population, the majority of people on Medicaid and other types of welfare are white people. I mean, that's just a numbers thing. Even though Blacks disproportionately represent more people, by our population in these different programs, the vast majority of people on these programs are indeed white, and they do have to deal with some of the income related disparities and biases that go along with that as well. But that's a great question. There's a lot more to it, but hopefully I answered it decently for you. Great questions. Keep them coming. All right. All right. As I mentioned earlier, we have in our healthcare system, we are learning more and more about the reality that the social determinants of health are beyond just medical care. I believe Dr. Fauci recently talked about how he said how these mass shootings and shootings that we're experiencing in our country are indeed a public health crisis, right? We're actually starting to pay more attention to things beyond medical care that indeed affect our health and well-being. And again, some effects more than others, but indeed that those are issues, and it happens in all types of different ways there. But again, I think it's important that we understand that these disparities and these different things that happen exist, and we need to address them. One of the things that my school is doing, we have an open forum for our Black and brown students to come to with a psychologist to be able to talk about and address some of the things that are going on with the Derek Chauvin trial, with other police shootings, anything like that they want to actually talk about, that they have a psychologist there to actually address some of these things with them and have a safe space to do it. A lot of these times that people don't even think about the health and psychological effects that these type of incidents have on people. All right, so I have a question here. Why is the majority on Medicaid white? What is keeping other races from these resources? And what I mentioned is that the majority of people on Medicaid are white simply because there are more white people by population in our country. Whites represent about 67% of the U.S. population. So by just the sheer numbers, we actually are looking at more white people on Medicaid than Black people, even though Black people are disproportionately represented because they tend to be disproportionately low income when it comes to Medicaid. And I will pause here to share as a little nugget of knowledge when it comes to certain things. So there's a stigma in our country, and we know this is free health clinics and free and charitable clinics, about people who are on Medicaid. There's this idea that people who are on Medicaid who are obviously low income are not worthy to be receiving this free healthcare. They should be out working instead of using Medicaid and so on and so forth. If you actually look at the actual enrollees versus the dollars spent on Medicaid, and I'll just sum it up quickly, working age adults, those who may be considered, a lot of times society says these are the Black and brown people who could be working and have jobs, but they're too lazy to work, and so they're on Medicaid. So 24% of all Medicaid enrollees are working age adults, but Medicaid actually only uses 12% of its dollars on working age adults. So even if you assume that every single working age adult on Medicaid is being lazy and just not working, it still only represents 12% of our spending. So well, Jeff, where's the other 88%? Children represent 49% of the people enrolled in Medicaid, but they only consume 19% of the dollars, and a lot of that is in neonatal care. Kids are generally healthy. The rest of the money goes towards people with disabilities and the elderly, dual eligibles who are elderly, who have Medicare and Medicaid, and people with disabilities. They consume 69% of the dollars. So when you look at it, children, people with disabilities, and the elderly is what we spent 88% of our Medicaid dollars on. And so any notion that Medicaid is this entitlement program that people don't deserve, and they want to cut it, which is always this, the conversation, cut Medicaid, because it's always the biggest thing on any state budget. The reality is that you're cutting healthcare for children, for the elderly, and for people with disabilities. And again, majority of those people being white in the first place. And so this is what I mean by having information and being informed, because when you hear people talk about stuff like that, we need to cut these entitlements, Well, know who you're talking about. Know who we're cutting healthcare from. The most disadvantaged and under people who can't defend for themselves, right? That's who we're talking about there. And so these are kind of things that I think is important to learn and understand in healthcare, so that we can buck up against the narrative, the many of these narratives that exist in our society there. And again, I won't go through a lot of these things, but I will say that, again, we have disparities everywhere. These slides should be available for you guys to look at later. But if you have any doubt whatsoever that there's disparities in healthcare, these statistics will show you otherwise. And not only are there disparities, but there's a whole long history of malpractice and malfeasance against African Americans in healthcare. This great book called Medical Apartheid addresses, the whole history of medical experimentation on Black Americans from all the way from colonial times to present. So that's another resource people in healthcare particularly should probably be aware of and look at. I will do a final pause here. I know we're running out of time. I want to see if there's any other questions as we get close to having to wrap up here. Then I'll share just a couple more things.
Jeff, there's a question in the chat about whether you would be able to would be willing to share your slides after the presentation.
Yes, I'll definitely be happy to.
That's great, thank you. And this is also being recorded for those who want to refer back. What IAFCC is keeping recordings.
Excellent. And so I'll leave off with something I've shared in the past with this presentation. This idea of race, recognizing, acknowledging, carrying, and examining. And again, I'm going to jump down. Feel free to look at these slides. I have all kinds of statistics and information and numbers about things, but I do want to share a couple of things. One, I'll briefly talk about is what I call smart failure. When we're wondering about how do we address this, some things we just have to give it a try, see what happens. And even if we fail, know that we're making progress, because at least we try something and learn from that experience. Sometimes we get, we have, paralysis by analysis. We try to kind of get everything figured out in advance, before we try anything. And before you know it, we're just not doing anything at all. So I would encourage us to use that creativity, engage in the community, like our speaker this morning said. We need to engage, be direct and engage with folks that we're trying to serve. And just know that we're not going to get it right all the time. We're going to mess up. Sometimes we're going to fall right flat on our face, but that's okay, because we're trying and we're moving forward when we do that. Got a couple extra these are TED Talks, by the way. Eddie Obang talking about smart failure, and Color Brave with Melly Hobson. I would strongly encourage you guys to, particularly for this one too, when she talks about racism, as someone who's in over a Fortune 1000 company there. Let me check these chat real quick. All right. So last thing I'll mention, just to stir the pot some more, there's going to be and have been conversations about reparations. I know that's one of those big defensive talks that people get into, but I just want to, share a reason why reparations is not such a far-fetched idea as people may think. When you look at the development of the United States on the economic scale, when the United States first founded in 1776, it was nothing on the map economically. It was a brand new country, right? But from 1776 up into, I'll just jump around. By the time we got to 1860, over half of all the money that the U.S. received from overseas came strictly from the cotton industry. And the United States was able to produce cotton so cheaply and deliver it so cheaply that it basically ran every other cotton business in the world out of business. And we became the sole provider of cotton. Imagine if there was only one country in the world that provided all the oil, how well off that country would be. That's exactly what happened with the United States. And obviously they were able to produce and deliver cotton at such a cheap price because of slavery. And so while the United States did things later that, enhances financial portfolio, it was really the cotton industry that set the foundation of why we are indeed by far the richest country in the world, the strongest economy in the world. That didn't happen by accident. It happened because of literally hundreds of years of free labor where everyone else was actually not utilizing slavery around the world. So in essence, when we talk about, there's this documentary series on History Channel that said The Men That Built America. Well, the people that built America were the slaves because they provided America with an economic base that allowed it to be the most powerful country in the world. And to this day, everyone who lives in the United States benefits from that. I think the statistics are if you are a US citizen and live in this country, you're already a part of the top 10% of the wealth in the world, just by default, but just by being here. That has occurred because of the practice of slavery over the years. And so when we talk about reparations, my thing is can we do a little bit here and there? My saying is that the most that can be done is the least that should be done. If you think about all the ramifications of what the legacy of slavery has provided the United States. And again, that's just another example of thinking outside the box and changing the narrative instead of just having this antagonistic idea about reparations. Well, think about why we even think about reparations being an issue or being a reality at all. And understanding that history, understanding those numbers and statistics that go along with that. Right, I think I'm about ready out of time. I'm gonna check the chat for anything else. Thank you for those who have put those links and chat books up there for me. I appreciate that very much. I can talk about this topic for a long time, especially as a professor. I do want to thank everyone for participating and listening in. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to share. I love to be able to provoke discussion and expand all of our horizons. And I hope that you'll take this and be able to do the same in your circles of influence. Thank you.